For decades, the dominant belief has been that control of this narrow corridor rests on military superiority, that whoever commands the most powerful navy ultimately decides whether energy flows or stops. It is a clean, intuitive model of power, reinforced by every map, every fleet deployment, every historical precedent. But it is also increasingly outdated, because control over Hormuz is no longer determined by who can block ships. It is determined by who defines the system those ships operate within. The real shift is already underway, and almost no one is describing it accurately. Iran is not losing its position because of external pressure alone. It is losing it because the nature of control itself is changing, and as that transformation accelerates, a different kind of power is emerging, one that does not rely on missiles, patrol routes, or territorial dominance. A power that operates quietly, structurally, and with far greater permanence. I am a geopolitical and financial systems analyst. I have spent over a decade studying energy corridors, strategic choke points, and the hidden financial architecture that underpins global trade. In the next 25 minutes, I will show you three things that are rarely explained together. First, the precise moment when control of the strait begins to shift away from physical dominance, and the structural weakness inside Iran's position that makes that shift inevitable. Second, the system that is quietly replacing traditional control, a system built not on geography, but on settlement, currency, and financial networks that most analysts overlook. And third, the identity of the one power that stands to benefit most from this transformation, not because it seizes the strait, but because it redesigns the rules that govern it. To understand what is happening, you have to abandon the idea that power in Hormuz is measured in ships or missiles. Because the day Iran loses the strait will not be marked by conflict. It will be marked by something far less visible and far more consequential. If you believe this kind of analysis matters, not as commentary, but as a way to understand how power is actually structured beneath the surface, then you already see why this conversation is different. The people watching this channel are not looking for comfort. They are looking for clarity before it becomes obvious to everyone else, before the system has already shifted and the conclusions are presented as hindsight. This video is not an isolated argument. It connects to a broader body of work, examining how financial systems, trade networks, and energy corridors are quietly being reconfigured. There is a reason why a separate analysis on the transformation of global settlement systems has become increasingly relevant to everything you are about to hear. For those who want to see these patterns early, to understand not just what is happening, but why it is happening, you are already part of a much smaller conversation. Because once you recognize where control is actually moving, the idea of losing the strait begins to mean something entirely different. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz compresses global energy into a corridor barely 33 kilometers wide, with usable shipping lanes of roughly 3 kilometers in each direction. Through that confined passage moves between 20 and 21 million barrels of oil per day, alongside nearly a third of the world's seaborne liquefied natural gas. On any given day, more than 80 to 100 large vessels pass through a route that leaves almost no room for deviation, where a single incident can halt traffic in both directions within hours. This is not open ocean. It is a controlled funnel bordered by Iran to the north and Oman to the south, with Iran occupying the dominant geographic position overlooking the most critical transit lanes. From elevated coastal terrain, Iran's surveillance systems can track vessel movement continuously. Its missile batteries, naval units, and drone networks are positioned within operational range of every tanker that enters the strait. But geography alone does not determine control. It only creates the conditions for leverage. For decades, that leverage has been understood in military terms as the ability to threaten closure or impose disruption. Yet the true value of Hormuz lies not in stopping flow, but in shaping the terms under which flow continues. And for over 40 years, Iran has relied on the implicit threat of disruption to project power through this corridor. That changes tonight. The system that once allowed Iran to translate geography into control is beginning to fracture, not because its physical position has weakened, but because the structure surrounding that position is evolving. Crack 1. The declining value of physical disruption. In 2019, attacks on tankers and energy infrastructure caused immediate price spikes, but those spikes proved temporary. Markets absorbed the shock faster than expected, adjusting through strategic reserves and diversified supply chains. The implication is counterintuitive. The more frequently disruption is threatened, the more resilient the system becomes. Iran's primary tool of influence is being diluted by repetition. Crack 2. The rise of redundant supply networks. Over the past decade, major importers have invested heavily in alternative routes and storage capacity. Pipelines bypassing Hormuz, such as those running through Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, now handle millions of barrels per day. Strategic petroleum reserves across Asia have expanded significantly. This does not eliminate dependence on the strait, but it reduces the urgency of any single disruption. The choke point remains critical, but no longer absolute. Crack 3. The fragmentation of enforcement. Western sanctions were once a cohesive system, backed by broad international alignment. Today, that alignment is uneven. Shadow fleets, ship-to-ship transfers, and reflagging operations have created a parallel network through which sanctioned oil continues to move. This weakens the clarity of control. If enforcement cannot be uniformly applied, then leverage becomes inconsistent. Crack 4. The shift from physical to financial leverage. Energy markets are no longer governed solely by supply and demand. They are governed by the systems through which transactions are cleared, insured, and settled. Increasingly, these systems are evolving beyond traditional frameworks. Alternative payment mechanisms, bilateral currency agreements, and new financial platforms are beginning to reshape how energy is traded. Control over the strait is slowly migrating away from physical access toward financial architecture. Crack 5. The changing geography of demand. The center of energy consumption has moved decisively toward Asia, particularly China and India. Yet the rules governing trade and security in Hormuz have historically been defined by Western institutions. This mismatch creates strategic tension. The actors most dependent on the strait are not the ones shaping its operational framework. Each of these cracks weakens the old model in a different way. Together, they render it increasingly obsolete. Iran still holds the geography, but geography alone is no longer sufficient to guarantee control. Nature abhors a vacuum. So does geopolitics, only more violently. Into that vacuum step three competing forces, each attempting to redefine what control over Hormuz actually means. Iran's strategy is to convert geographic dominance into negotiated influence by attaching conditions to access. Its greatest strength remains its position along the northern coastline, an advantage no external actor can replicate. But its fatal blind spot is over-reliance on legacy leverage. It continues to operate under the assumption that physical disruption remains its strongest tool, even as the system shifts toward financial mechanisms. Iran is not losing, but Iran is no longer enough. The United States approaches the strait through a doctrine of guaranteed access backed by naval superiority. Its greatest strength is its unmatched ability to project power and maintain a persistent presence in the region. Carrier groups, surveillance networks, and decades of operational experience give it dominance at sea, but its blind spot is structural rigidity. It is optimized for controlling physical space, not for adapting to financial systems that operate beyond traditional enforcement. The United States is not losing, but the United States is no longer enough. China represents a third approach, focused on securing energy access through economic integration and alternative systems. Its strategy is to reduce vulnerability to choke points by building parallel networks of trade and settlement. Its greatest strength is its position as the largest energy importer in the world, giving it influence over how transactions are structured. But its blind spot is exposure during transition. Until these alternative systems are fully mature, it remains dependent on the very choke points it seeks to bypass. China is not losing, but China is no longer enough. And then there is the force that does not appear in naval deployments or territorial maps. The force that ultimately determines who controls not the strait itself, but the system that gives the strait its meaning. The real winner is the settlement architecture of global energy trade. This system operates beneath the surface of geopolitics. It consists of the currencies used to price oil, the clearing networks that process transactions, the insurance frameworks that enable shipping, and the contractual structures that define risk. It is not controlled by a single country, but by a network of institutions, agreements, and evolving mechanisms that determine how energy moves through the global economy. To understand its power, imagine the strait as a highway. For decades, control has meant controlling the road itself: who can pass, who is blocked, who is escorted. But the settlement architecture is the toll system, the payment network, the rules that determine who is allowed to use the road and under what conditions. If you control the toll system, you do not need to block the road, you define its usage. This is where the shift becomes irreversible. Iran can influence the physical passage, but it does not control the financial infrastructure that governs global trade. The United States built that infrastructure over decades, but it is now being challenged by alternative systems that operate outside its direct influence. China and other emerging actors are investing heavily in these alternatives, not to seize the strait, but to redefine how it is used. The country that designs and scales this system will hold more real power over global energy flows than any military force that has ever patrolled the waters of Hormuz. Sometime in the next 5 years, the transition becomes visible. A consortium of major energy importers and exporters formalizes a new settlement framework for oil transactions moving through Hormuz. The strait remains open. Tankers continue to pass without interruption. But the terms of trade begin to shift. Contracts are increasingly denominated in a mix of currencies. Insurance is provided through alternative institutions, backed by state guarantees rather than traditional Western firms. Clearing systems operate through new digital platforms that bypass established channels. At first, the volumes are small, almost symbolic, but they grow steadily, transaction by transaction. Markets adjust, not with panic, but with recalibration. Price benchmarks begin to reflect multiple systems rather than a single dominant one. The shift is gradual, almost invisible, until it reaches a tipping point where participation in the new framework becomes not an exception, but a necessity. On the surface, nothing has changed. The strait is open, ships are moving, energy is flowing. But beneath that continuity, control has already shifted. And on that day, the Strait of Hormuz will have changed hands, not through blockade, not through conflict, but through the quiet redefinition of the system that governs it. There are, however, conditions under which this outcome does not materialize. The first is a reassertion of unified control over global financial systems by existing powers. If alternative settlement mechanisms are effectively constrained or absorbed, the shift toward parallel systems could stall before reaching critical scale. This would require sustained coordination and enforcement that has been difficult to maintain but remains possible. The second is a disruption within the emerging systems themselves. Technological failure, lack of trust, or internal fragmentation could prevent these alternatives from achieving the reliability required for global adoption. Without confidence, even the most innovative systems fail to displace established ones. The third is a fundamental change in energy dynamics. A rapid transition away from oil dependence, driven by technological or policy shifts, could reduce the strategic importance of Hormuz altogether. If the flow of energy diminishes, so too does the value of controlling its passage. These scenarios are not theoretical. They represent real constraints on the trajectory described here. But absent these disruptions, the direction of change is already set, even if its full implications remain largely unseen. Iran is not losing the Strait of Hormuz in a conventional sense. It is losing the ability to define how power is exercised through it, as control shifts from geography to financial architecture. Let me leave you with my prediction, stated plainly, so there is no ambiguity about what I am saying. Within the next 15 years, Iran will retain physical proximity to the strait, but its ability to convert that position into decisive leverage will steadily erode as alternative systems reduce the impact of disruption. It will still matter, but it will no longer define outcomes. Iran will not lose the strait. It will lose control over its meaning. The United States will remain present in the Gulf, but its role will be redefined from dominant enforcer to stabilizing participant. It will guarantee baseline security, but it will not dictate the financial or contractual frameworks governing energy flows. Its power will persist, but its exclusivity will not. The United States will not withdraw, but it will no longer set the terms. Regional powers, particularly Saudi Arabia and India, will achieve something more subtle but more enduring. They will diversify both supply routes and settlement systems, operating across multiple frameworks simultaneously. This will allow them to reduce dependency on any single power structure while increasing their strategic autonomy. They will not choose a system. They will learn to operate between them. And the emerging force, the settlement architecture of global energy trade, will consolidate quietly and decisively. Transactions conducted outside traditional systems will expand from marginal to routine, supported by parallel insurance, clearing, and pricing mechanisms. Control will shift to those who design and manage these systems, not those who patrol the waters. The system will not dominate visibly, it will become indispensable. I want to be honest with you about what this means. Those who believe in open, rules-based global systems will find this transition deeply unsettling because the clarity of a single framework will give way to overlapping, competing structures. Stability will not disappear, but it will become more conditional, more dependent on alignment between systems rather than enforcement by one. Those who prioritize national sovereignty and regional autonomy will see opportunity in this fragmentation. The ability to negotiate terms, to bypass constraints, to operate within multiple frameworks will expand, but so will the complexity of maintaining that position. Power will be more accessible, but also more contested, and those who care about economic access and financial security will find themselves navigating a system where predictability is no longer anchored in a single architecture. Risk will not be eliminated. It will be redistributed across systems that interact in ways that are harder to model and harder to control. The world is not moving toward a more stable version of the same old order. It is moving toward something genuinely new. At its narrowest point, just 33 kilometers of water separates the flow of global energy from disruption. For decades, that narrow corridor has been understood as a physical vulnerability, something that could be blocked, defended, or controlled by force. But what we now see is that its true significance was never just physical. It was systemic. Those 33 kilometers are no longer simply a passage of ships. They are a gateway between competing architectures of power. If you stayed until this point, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. This is not about following events. It is about understanding the systems that shape them before they become obvious. Tell me in the comments, which scenario do you believe is most likely, and why? I read every response, and the discussion often reveals as much as the analysis itself. The next analysis will go somewhere most channels will not, into a layer of the global system that remains largely invisible. Stay curious, stay informed, question everything, especially the analysis that tells you the answer is simple.